Hello. Today we will delve into one of the most disturbing and unsolved stories of disappearance in the wild in the American Northwest. This is a case in which official reports leave more questions than answers, and the evidence found points to something that has no place in zoology textbooks. This is not a story about an accident or an attack by a known predator. This is the story of an experienced hunter who entered a forest he had known all his life and encountered something that shattered his rifle and left traces on the ground that even seasoned trackers found hard to believe. This is the case of Gary Lawton. In November 1988, 41-year-old Gary Lawton, a resident of Port Angeles, Washington, set out on his annual elk hunt. It was a tradition he had upheld for years. Gary was not just an amateur. He grew up in these parts, in the shadow of the Olympic Mountains, and the wilds of Squamish were his second home. His friends who went with him on that trip, there were 3 of them besides Gary himself, later told investigators in unison, "Gary knew that forest better than we know our own backyards." He was an experienced tracker, had excellent navigational skills, and knew how to survive in harsh conditions. He was not the kind of person who could get lost. Their camp was located in a relatively remote part of the forest, about 12 miles from the nearest dirt road, which they had reached in off-road vehicles. It was their 3rd night there. The first 2 days passed quietly. They set traps, studied tracks, and enjoyed the silence and fresh air. They were hunting by driving, a method where several people take up strategic positions while 1 or 2 try to drive the animal in the desired direction. At dawn on the 3rd day, when a cold, gray light was beginning to appear over the tops of the fir trees, Gary Lawton left the camp. He was fully equipped, a warm hunting suit, a backpack with supplies for the day, and his trusty rifle, a powerful .308 Winchester carbine. He told his friends that he would take up a position on the eastern ridge, a known moose crossing point. They agreed to keep in touch by radio, with the first check scheduled for noon. Gary went into the forest, and no one saw him alive again. When noon came, Gary's radio was silent. His friend Michael called him several times, but all he heard was a faint hiss of static. At first, they didn't think much of it. Anything could have happened. The radio might have run out of battery, or Gary could have been distracted by an animal and not heard the call. Sounds travel poorly in dense forests, and radio signals can be lost due to the terrain. They shouted and honked, but there was no response. Anxiety began to grow as evening approached. November days are short, and twilight falls quickly in the Washington woods. When the sun started to set behind the mountain ridge and Gary still hadn't appeared, his friends realized that something serious had happened. They began searching on their own. They combed the area around the camp, constantly shouting his name and firing shots into the air, standard signals for someone who is lost. The night passed in anxious anticipation. The next morning, having waited in vain for their friend, they packed up camp and headed to the nearest ranger station to report him missing. From that moment on, an official search and rescue operation began. Dozens of people took part in it: national park rangers, volunteers from local hunting clubs, and the county police. The search area was vast and complex to comb through, with thick undergrowth, steep slopes, and fallen trees. The first 2 days yielded absolutely nothing. No traces, no abandoned items, not a single clue as to where Gary Lawton might have gone. The weather was cold but clear, ruling out the possibility that he had lost his bearings due to snowfall or fog. He was in excellent physical condition, so a heart attack or sudden illness also seemed unlikely. There were no signs of an attack by a bear or cougar, the usual predators in the area. On the 3rd day of the search, when hope was beginning to fade, one of the volunteers, making his way through the ferns, about 2.5 miles from where Gary was supposed to have set up his ambush, stumbled upon something that made him freeze. Gary's rifle was lying under an old fir tree, but the condition it was in defied all logical explanation. The wooden stock of the rifle was broken into several pieces, as if it had been struck against a rock with superhuman force. But the most disturbing thing was that the thick steel barrel was bent at an unnatural angle. Deep dents were visible on the metal. The expert gunsmiths who later examined the rifle concluded that such damage would have required a hydraulic press or a series of mighty, targeted blows. There was not a drop of blood near the gun. No signs of a struggle or dragging. Just a broken weapon lying on the forest floor. A few feet from the rifle, searchers found his cartridge belt. It had been torn off, not removed. One of the straps had been ripped off with flesh, and the buttons had been torn out. A tiny piece of fabric from his hunting jacket was hanging from it. Again, there were no traces of blood or signs of a struggle. It was as if something had torn the ammunition off him with tremendous force. But the strangest thing was under his feet. There were footprints on the soft, damp moss, where prints are remarkably well preserved, and these were not animal tracks. They were prints that looked like bare human feet, but their size was monstrous. Each print was between 18 and 19 inches long, like almost 50 centimeters. They had distinct heels and toes, but the arch of the foot was disproportionately wide and flat, unlike a human foot. Experts from the wildlife department who arrived at the scene were baffled. In the official report, these tracks were described in extremely cautious terms. An unknown biological trace, not corresponding to any known species of mammal in the region. When a search dog, a German shepherd, was brought to the site, it confidently picked up the rifle tracks and led the group up the slope. It traveled about 400 yards and then suddenly stopped dead in its tracks. The hair on its neck stood on end. The dog began to growl, tuck its tail between its legs, and desperately pull back on the leash, refusing to move forward. This behavior was not like a reaction to a bear or other animal she was familiar with. It was a fear of something completely foreign. The searchers were unable to get her to take another step along the trail. Gary Lawton's trail ended here on this slope, next to the unexplained footprints and a dog scared to death. The discovery of the broken rifle and the mysterious tracks completely changed the course of the investigation. Now it was no longer a matter of finding a lost person, but of trying to understand what force he had encountered. The search operation was intensified. The area was combed more thoroughly, meter by meter. More experienced investigators joined the case and tried to reconstruct the events. They came to the conclusion that Gary had most likely encountered someone or something at the very spot where his rifle was found. He hadn't fired the gun. There was a bullet in the chamber, but no shell casings were found nearby. This meant that the event that led to the weapon's malfunction was sudden and violent. He didn't even have time to fire a shot. What could have bent the rifle barrel and broken the stock without leaving any traces of blood? The theory that he had fallen from a height was immediately ruled out. To cause such damage, he would have had to fall from a cliff several dozen meters high, but the terrain in that area was relatively flat. In addition, the fall would have left marks on the body, and there was no body. The theory that he had been attacked by another person also did not stand up to scrutiny. No human being has the physical strength to bend a .308 caliber rifle barrel with their bare hands. Besides, why would the attacker leave such obvious and strange evidence at the scene of the crime as a broken rifle? The traces were the central mystery. They were photographed and plaster casts were made, but they were never identified. They were not bear tracks. Bears have claws, and the shape of their feet is entirely different. nor were they the tracks of a person wearing special shoes. The prints were too clear, with details indicating a bare foot, including the texture of the skin, which could be seen on one of the best casts. The size and proportions did not match any known primate. The case was at a dead end. It was at this point in the story that a detail emerged that was not included in the official reports, but which was later revealed on condition of anonymity by one of the search team members to a local journalist. About 150 yards from where the rifle was found, the group stumbled upon a strangely damaged tree. It was a young fir tree, as thick as a telegraph pole. Its trunk was broken at a height of about 9 feet, or almost 3 meters above the ground. The tree had not been cut down or blown over by the wind. It had been broken cleanly, like a matchstick. Several tufts of dark, stiff hair, unlike that of a bear or moose, hung from the jagged break, caught on splinters. According to this volunteer, the ranger who led their group carefully examined the find, collected samples of the fur in a bag, but ordered no one to spread the word or mention it in their report. Why this finding was concealed is anyone's guess. Perhaps the authorities did not want to cause panic, or maybe they encountered something that simply did not fit into standard protocols and decided not to publicize evidence that seemed too fantastical. Meanwhile, investigators questioned Gary's friends repeatedly, and some details emerged that they had not initially considered significant. The night before Gary disappeared, while sitting around a campfire, they heard strange sounds coming from the ridge. It was not the howling of a wolf or the roar of a bear. One of them described it as a long cry that turned into a kind of guttural chatter. They dismissed it as an owl or other nocturnal animal, but admitted that the sound was unusual and disturbing. In addition, the day before Gary disappeared while scouting the area, Michael, one of the friends, thought for a moment that someone was watching them from behind the thick undergrowth. He stopped and looked, but saw nothing. He dismissed it as a trick of the imagination, that feeling you sometimes get in a dense forest. But after Gary's disappearance, these memories took on a sinister tone. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, the operation was officially called off. Neither Gary Lawton's body, nor his backpack, nor any other piece of his clothing or equipment was ever found. He vanished. The county sheriff's final report stated, "Disappearance. Under unclear circumstances. Third-party involvement cannot be ruled out. Traces found at the scene do not match any known animals in the region. An accident due to disorientation is unlikely, given the experience of the missing person and the weather conditions." Shortly after that, another strange event occurred. The Washington State Department of Fish and Game temporarily closed the section of forest where Gary disappeared for an indefinite period. The official explanation was unusually high bear activity in the area. However, local hunters and trackers were skeptical of this statement. At the end of November, bears are usually preparing for hibernation, and their activity decreases. There were no other reports of encounters with aggressive bears in the area. To many, this seemed like a clumsy attempt by the authorities to keep people away from the site of an unexplained incident. Gary Lawton's case remained in the archives as an unsolved disappearance. The media did not pay much attention to it, with only a few notes in local newspapers. The story did not become a national sensation. It turned into a quiet, eerie legend, retold around campfires by hunters and tourists, venturing into the wild forests of the Olympic Peninsula. A legend that something huge, powerful, and hostile to humans lived in those forests. Years passed. The story of Gary Lawton was gradually forgotten, remaining only a line in the statistics of missing persons, and a topic of discussion on a few internet forums dedicated to the inexplicable. His family never received any answers. His friends stopped going hunting in those places. the Sasquatch forest kept it secret. But in 2003, 5 years after the disappearance, the story took an unexpected and frightening turn. The witness was a man named David Barnett, an amateur ornithologist from Seattle. He was not a hunter and had no connection to the Lawton case. In the fall of 2003, he went on a hike to the same area to observe rare bird species. The section of the forest that had been closed in 1988 had long since been reopened to the public. Barnett was alone. He left the main trail and went deeper into the forest in search of the woodpeckers he was looking for. At one point, he realized he was a little lost. He took out his compass and map to get his bearings, and just then he heard the crack of branches ahead. The sound was as if something substantial was breaking through the undergrowth. His first thought was a moose or a bear. Barnett froze, trying not to make a sound, and prepared to slowly back away. But what he saw a few seconds later made his blood run cold. Between the tree trunks about 70 yards away, a creature was moving. It was huge, at least 8 or 9 feet tall. It was covered with thick, dark, almost black fur. It moved on 2 legs, but its gait was strange, inhuman, crouched, with long, swinging arms that nearly reached its knees. The creature did not walk, but instead lumbered along, yet it did so with incredible speed and power, breaking bushes and small trees in its path. Barnett saw it for only a few seconds. It moved perpendicular to his line of sight and did not seem to notice him. He didn't have time to make out its face, but he was struck by its proportions. Broad shoulders and a massive build. It was definitely not a man in a costume or a bear standing on its hind legs. Its movements were too smooth and natural for an animal walking on 2 legs. Overcome with primal fear, Barnett didn't wait to see if the creature had noticed him. He turned and ran, not caring where he went, pushing through branches and tripping over roots. He ran until his lungs burned and didn't stop until he reached a familiar trail. He didn't look back. Back in civilization, he told several friends about his encounter. Still, they just laughed, suggesting that he had been scared by a bear. He tried to convince himself of this, but the image of the vast, dark silhouette moving silently and powerfully through the forest would not leave his mind. A few months later, while randomly browsing the internet, he came across an article about unsolved cases in Washington state and read the story of Gary Lawton. All the details fell into place. The area where he had seen the creature was only a few miles from where Lawton's broken rifle had been found. The description of a vast, 2-legged creature matched the giant footprints perfectly. The incredible strength needed to break a tree trunk 9 feet high pointed to the fact that he might have seen Gary Lawton's killer. David Barnett contacted the county sheriff's office and told his story. They listened to him, took his statement, but apparently did not take it seriously. No further investigation was launched. His story was filed away with an old, dusty case. So what happened in that forest in November 1988? If you put all the facts together, a terrifying picture emerges. Gary Lawton, an experienced hunter, encountered something on his property that local Native American legends refer to as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. This creature, possessing enormous strength and possibly hostile to intruders on its territory, took Gary by surprise. It didn't just kill him, it destroyed his weapons, demonstrating its overwhelming power. Then it carried away the body, leaving almost no traces behind, except those that could not be missed, giant footprints in the damp moss. Faced with evidence they could neither explain nor refute, footprints, a broken rifle, and possibly samples of fur from the tree itself, the authorities chose not to set a precedent. To acknowledge the existence of a giant primate unknown to science in the forests of North America would have meant causing mass panic, an influx of thrill-seeking hunters, and completely redrawing the safety map of national parks. it was much easier to close off the area of forest for a while under the pretext of bear activity and quietly bury the case in the archives. The story of Gary Lawton is not just a tale of a missing person. It serves as a reminder that our planet still has unexplored areas, and that the most remote and wild forests may harbor things we find hard to believe exist, until the next hunter or tourist comes face to face with it and leaves behind only broken items and tracks that lead nowhere.